success.
Coming up on the show, we're going to look at the chances of this G20 meeting achieving anything more than just some positive pictures for the world leaders, and we'll look at how the dust has settled on the US election with our panel, Bruce Walpy and James Morrow. First, though, to our guest this afternoon, the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, COAG, and the Emissions Trading Scheme, Andrew Robb. Mr Robb, thank you for joining us. Can I start by asking for your thoughts on this G20 summit? Do you think Kevin Rudd should have gone to Washington or stayed at home?
Oh, no, on this occasion I think it's appropriate, very appropriate that he be there. I just hope that he spends more time listening and soaking it up rather than lecturing.
Because your colleague Joe Hockey today said, and I quote, "The government should focus on what is happening in Australia. Kevin Rudd should not be going overseas just to lecture the world about what he thinks is good for it." But do you think there is a case for the Prime Minister to be there?
Well, as I say, I agree with Joe. He shouldn't be there to lecture people. His job there is to listen in many respects and to make some assessment of the actions being taken by other major powers around the world, how it's going to impact on Australia and how we can shield ourselves, if you like, from some of the worst effects of this financial meltdown. It's not necessary. Could I just say, David, it is not necessary that we are affected as other countries are. We will be impacted, but bear in mind, we had no net debt 12 months ago. We still have no net debt because of sensible economic management for 12 years. You take the United States, their debt is 50% of their GDP. They're in a demonstrably worse position. There is no reason why we should be so affected. But the Prime Minister's got to look at what the other countries are doing and see how we can avoid a lot of the worst effects.
There is, as you know, a lot of debate about whether there's a need for an overhaul of the architecture, and by that I mean the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, whether we need a new international system to deal with global finance, essentially, to prevent this sort of thing happening again, or happening as badly as it has this time. Do you think there is a need for that sort of structural change on a global level, and can it really be achieved?
I think there's been an overreaction or a propensity to blame everything on regulation or lack of regulation or inappropriate regulation around the world. It's almost as though all of those that see intervention as the solution to every problem in the world, those people who want to control things, who feel that people can't make good decisions for themselves, are going to seize this opportunity to put more and more layers of regulation. Now, we've got to have regulation, and Australia introduced sensible regulation over the last 12 years, which is the envy of the world. But people have forgotten that a lot of the seeds of this were sown back in the Asian crisis, where a lot of those countries saw the disadvantage of not having reserves. They've spent 12 years or more building up reserves, 10 years building up reserves, which had to be spent around the world. That created the bubble. And because those Asian countries had fixed exchange rates, it exported a lot of problems to the rest of the world. Now, again, it was the lack of a free market in exchange rates that really sowed the seeds for a lot of what we're seeing today. Then the regulatory issue compounded it. So we can't rush to see regulation as the answer. We've got to stay true to the market. That ultimately, people making decisions for themselves, is the solution to having, the best quality of life that we can achieve.
And on the outlook for the Australian economy, I have to ask you, Andrew Robb, about your comments about the fact that there could have been some manipulation in the latest forecast for growth. Ken Henry, the Treasury Secretary, says those comments were unhelpful. Can you just clarify, what did you mean by saying there was a smell of manipulation about these figures?
It was really a query to the government, not to Ken Henry. This document of mid-year forecast is the Treasurer's document. It is a document that he can change, and in fact it's a matter of public record that back in the 90s, Paul Keating, and Peter Walsh documented this in a book, Paul Keating physically changed the growth forecasts to enable the political selling of the One Nation program. And
so you're suggesting that's what Wayne Swan did here?
I wasn't suggesting. I was probing, and I wanted an answer. I wanted an answer from Wayne Swan. I wanted from the government. What has happened here is the government is...
Well, Ken Henry's given an answer. Ken Henry's given an answer that the figures weren't changed.
No, this is a government document. The government has now spent months actually using a lot of officials as human shields to avoid probing and questioning. And the government is using, it's almost a McCarthyist approach. If you query anything about infrastructure, you're against nation building. If you query immigration, you're a racist. You know, if you ask questions about their emissions trading scheme, you're a sceptic. And if you question any of their documentation, you're viciously attacking the officials. Now, this is a technique of the government.
If you accuse the government of changing the figures